Okay, so starting our series on Deuteronomy. I feel like I'm extremely loud, but if I turn this off, I'll be inaudible on the live stream. And joining on the live stream, the handouts are up on the website, right? Yep, so you can find this to follow along. And when we're reading, if you're joining online, we're using the English Standard Version. So if you wish to follow along on your own Bible or on some sort of app, that would be the version that you're going to hear us reading. So a few things that I want to do with Deuteronomy, since we're sort of setting the table for the next 7 weeks. I want to talk about what is the title, who wrote the book. We're going to talk a little bit about covenants, because I think without understanding an Old Testament covenant, it's much more difficult to understand what's happening in Deuteronomy. So you can see our schedule is printed up there. This would be a handy sheet to hold on to. You will get more out of the class if you have a chance to read the chapters before the session. But I've intentionally designed the session so that if the week gets away from you and you haven't had a chance to read, it will hopefully still be a fruitful experience for you. We'll read a lot of the key passages together in the study. Also, you'll note, we're not going verse by verse. I mean, this is 34 chapters, and so we would be 5 years from now before we finished our study on Deuteronomy. So we're going to hit highlights. We're going to do a little bit of that today. Next week, we'll be able to do pretty much all of chapter 4, but then we'll immediately depart from the idea that we could cover everything, and we'll hit kind of some main points. What that means is I'm going to try, we'll see how well I succeed at it, leaving some time at the end of each session that if something that really struck you from the reading for that week wasn't something that we covered in the discussion, that'll be the chance to say, hey, what about this chapter or verse or this occurrence? And that would be a good way to be able to cover more than just what I thought we would want to talk about, and that's of value to everybody. So we had a wonderful attendance this morning, really robust. I'll try to share what some of their observations were as best I can remember them as well. So it's kind of participatory in that way. Very sorry that the live stream didn't work, and we'll try to get that working by next week. So starting with the name, Deuteronomy. Any of you know what Deuteronomy means? I was surprised. Somebody actually did know this morning. Deuteros is Greek for second. Nomos is Greek for law. So literally it's second law, but it's not that God had already given a first law and he now was giving a second. This is a second telling of the law that God gave. The speaker throughout almost all of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses. Historically, it's been handed down to us, I see no reason to disagree with it, that Moses was in fact the author of the text. Even if somebody else was writing down his words, you're going to see the vast bulk of the text is Moses speaking. However, it does record Moses' death, which would have been quite a task for Moses to record himself, so it's kind of agreed on that probably was written by Joshua post Moses' departure from this life, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that, though it doesn't actually occur until the very end, until the seventh session, at least the way I have it laid out right now. Oh, also, if anybody likes to be able to have next week's handout and questions and so forth kind of on hand while you're reading through the text, they're down in Fellowship Hall right now. I can easily grab them. And are they already up online as well? All right, awesome. Thanks, Joe. So they're already up on the website as well. So Deuteronomy, second giving of the law. Moses is the author. And we're going to talk about what's the setting. What's going on? Because this is one of the times that the text itself actually makes it very clear what the background was, who's there, what's taking place. But before we get into the text itself, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about ancient Near Eastern covenants, the covenants at the time of the Old Testament's composition, because I think you'll see once we've covered that really is the format for the entire book. And it's also helpful because if you were here, it was probably almost 2 years ago now when we did the survey of the Old Testament. It might be even more than 2 years ago. I believe that one of the best frameworks for understanding the content of the Old Testament is to look at the different covenants that God formed with Adam, and then with Noah, and then with Abraham, which we'll reference a little bit today, and then with Moses, and then with David, and then God promises the new covenant that's going to come. And so I think those are helpful. There's a lot of Old Testament, and it's very helpful to be able to keep track of where are we and what's happening, and where are God's people, and where are we in the story of salvation. So Does anybody know, and it's a small group, so I won't leave you hanging long, but what is a covenant? How would you define? It's not a word that we use a ton, but it does still show up sometimes in modern usage. What's a covenant?
It's like a contract.
Like a contract. Yep, Jonathan, is that what you're going to say? Yeah, a contract or an agreement, or sometimes it might be compared to a treaty that can be signed. And so what we're looking at specifically has been called by scholars a suzerain vassal treaty. So if that comes up on Jeopardy, you'll know what that is. So suzerain and vassal. Suzerain is the one with authority. It might be a sovereign, it might not. But a suzerain is the one who is reigning. That's S-U-Z-E-R-A-I-N, suzerain. And then vassal, you might be familiar with, V-A-S-S-A-L. That's a subject. So typically what happened, and there are others that exist outside of the biblical text that we've found in other sources and other historical archaeological finds. And what would happen was, typically it was when one people was conquering another people. Then you would enter into one of these suzerain vassal treaties or covenants, suzerain vassal covenant. Sometimes these were negotiated even before any warfare started. You know, if one army comes and the other army takes a look and they're like, we're not going to be able to win this one, that's where they would go out and try to negotiate terms. It's not really the same as a surrender, because if the terms were too harsh, then they could say, nope, we're not doing that, we might as well try to fight it out. Or sometimes after fighting had taken place, these covenants, a suzerain vassal covenant, could be sort of the armistice. It could be the agreement of bringing the warfare to an end. So typically, it's not a covenant between equals. When we think of a contract, we usually think, well, either party could sign it or could not sign it. But this is usually between a conqueror and a conquered, or at least the much more powerful and the much less powerful. So there are some common elements. These don't all have to be present, but these elements are usually, most of them are present in an ancient covenant. And you'll see most of them are present in God's covenants with his people and present here in the book of Deuteronomy. So the first thing is a title, just who is this covenant in between? And then that's immediately followed by a historical prologue. So that's going to say the setting, the cause, the circumstance under which the covenant is being signed. So this could be, if we were to go with a secular example, this could be, between the Amorites and the Hittites on the occasion of their battle, in which the Amorites have defeated the Hittites, and therefore, right? So that it's just going to be, we have a title of who's the covenant or contract between, and enough of a prologue to explain why they're forming this covenant. Then the guts of it is the stipulations. These are the terms of the contract. These are the things that are being agreed to. This party agrees to this. The other party is agreeing to this. So it might be that the conquering party is not going to destroy the people. So let's say we'll go with those Amorites and Hittites. So let's say the Amorites had won. The Amorites might say, we agree not to destroy the Hittites or to take them into slavery. And then in return, the Hittites are agreeing that they're going to pay us 100 gold talents every month, or whatever the terms would be. So here's the stipulations. It's the terms of the contract. This would sometimes often be followed by terms of deposit. So where is this record going to be kept? So that there's a place that it can be proven. Oftentimes in ancient Near East, this would actually be a carved stone monument, so that everybody could see what the agreement was and what the terms were. We tend to think of this as, a safety deposit box somewhere or something like that. That's not the way they functioned back then. So there might be the specific terms of deposit. There might be specific terms of witnesses. Who were the witnesses to this covenant being formed, who could then give testimony that this is a valid thing? And then almost always, you'll have the blessings and the curses. If these terms are kept, these are the blessings. So we're sticking with the Amorites and the Hittites here. If the Hittites continue to pay their payment to the Amorites, then the Amorites will, in their turn, agree to help to defend the Hittites' land. Not only not conquer it, but actually help to defend it. On the other hand, the curses are if you did not keep the terms of the covenant. So that could also be if the Hittites fail to pay their tribute to the Amorites, then the Amorites now have the right to wipe out the Hittites and to take all of their possessions. Something along these lines. I'm making all of those things up, but those are the types of things that a covenant might include. So title, historical prologue, stipulations, deposit, witness, blessings, and curses. And if we had enough time, we could look at the ways that, for instance, in Genesis chapter 15 and then 17, God's covenant with Abraham, we could look at the ways that a lot of these boxes get checked off. You could even look, it's been applied to God's covenant with Adam and Eve in the garden or with Noah. I think the lens of covenant is a helpful way to understand those, and you'd see a lot of these elements are present there. That's a deeper dive than we have time to do right now, although I do have some resources on that if anybody wants to do a deeper dive on your own time. But at this point, before we move into the text itself, any questions about ancient Near Eastern covenants? All right, fairly clear? Yeah, that's a little more lecture than discussion. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
Is this the kind of covenant when Jesus talks about if there's a king afar off and you see that he's more powerful than you? Is this what?
Yeah, oh yes, yeah, when he's talking about when the king is far off and you see that his army is more powerful than you go and you make a deal with them. Yes, this is exactly the sort of thing that you could do. So it actually could be proposed either direction from what I understand, which would be, so let's say you're in your city and it's a small city and you don't have a large army, you see a large army marching against you, then yeah, you're going to hurry out and you're going to say, all right, listen, we agree to not fight in return for we'll pay you this tribute and we'll be willing to be considered part of your empire, or that sort of thing. Yeah, they're still far off, you try to make that arrangement. My understanding, I don't want to go too far afield here, but it actually can inform our understanding even of the Crusades, to understand what the expectations were, even up into medieval times, of if you were the besieged city, what would happen if you chose to enter into a treaty, if you chose to treat with the invading army, or if you chose to hold out. Because if you chose to hold out, then it was the agreement that this is total warfare. And that's why sometimes the Crusades, a lot of brutality, lots of stuff that's not worth trying to defend, but the Crusades are sometimes misunderstood through a modern lens because they'll say, well, when they went to Jerusalem, they sacked Jerusalem and they went through and they destroyed everybody and they took everything. Well, that's because under the rules of siege warfare, which still applied in usage at the time, if you held out in a siege, hoping to outlast the army, and they're running out of supplies as they go on, then you've agreed this is total warfare. And if they ever breach the wall, they're taking what they can get. You can't try to hold out for 6 months and then try to come to some sort of terms. I mean, you could potentially, you could see if they're willing to do that. But if you hold out and you don't surrender, all bets are off. And so, again, I don't love the idea of the atrocities that were committed in the name of the church or in the name of Christ during the Crusades. But they're misunderstood if you don't understand what siege warfare involved and some of the things that would surround, like covenants. So that you're absolutely right to point to that example that Jesus uses as well. So, other thoughts with covenants themselves before we get into... We're actually not going to get into this one very much today. We're going to see some of the historical background. Jonathan?
So you said this was one type of them? Are there other types that show up in the Bible?
I'm not familiar with any other types that show up in the Bible, and to be honest, I'm not well enough read in ancient Near Eastern history to know if there are other types, other than I do believe that the suzerain vassal thing, the fact that one is clearly the authority and the other is clearly either the defeated party or they're admitting it would be defeat if we tried to fight, that it's not just a covenant between equals. That's the nature of the suzerain vassal treaty. And because of that, there may be biblical examples of other treaties, but anytime it's a treaty between God, or a covenant between God and his people, you're going to have inevitably this power differential that would make it more of a suzerain vassal. I believe that the answer is yes, that we do have some other examples, but they may all be extra scriptural. They may not be any examples in Scripture. But we do see examples in Scripture of covenants, that marrying a son to a daughter and what the agreements would be as far as like dowry or that sort of thing. Those are other covenants, business agreements. I don't know if we get any specific terms, but I think that these, the covenants, at least as far as understanding the structure of the Old Testament, tend to fall in this suzerain vassal because they're between God and his people. So there's that power differential. A good question. And something that we can look into more. If you remind me, I can look into and see if there's more resources out there as far as other types of covenants and what are the distinctives and that sort of thing. Okay, so taking a look then into Deuteronomy. So we're now into the text on page 145 is where we start. I usually kind of go around the room and ask for volunteers to read, but since I'm the only one with a microphone, it'll be easier for those who are joining us online if I go ahead and read the text, and then we'll discuss. And like I said, I'll try to bring in anything I can remember from thoughts that were shared this morning from the participants as well. So, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1 to verse 3. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. And then there's a bit more of the historical setting there, but I'm going to pause right there with a few questions. So overall, it's not addressed specifically yet in the text, but we're talking about the Israelites here. Do you know where they're coming from? And why were they where they were coming from? What's the most recent background for the Israelites? We're here in the 5th book of the Pentateuch. The 5 books of Moses is how they've been traditionally understood. I see no reason to doubt that. So we're in the 5th book. So what's been happening? Go ahead, Cheryl. Yep.
They didn't go into the promised land because the spies gave a bad report. So
Right.
The consequence was they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years.
Yes. So when Moses speaks, and this is going to be a little bit potentially confusing today, Moses is speaking, but once we get into the events, he's going to be speaking about events that happened 40 years before. So in those 40 years, and we're going to cover why this was what was happening, but in those 40 years, God's people have been wandering around in the wilderness. So if we rewind backwards to the events that we're about to read about in chapter 1, what had just happened when the people come to the southern border here? Well, actually, we're going to get to that in a moment. Sorry, I went a little bit out of this order this morning. I was just about to do the same thing this afternoon. So where they were coming from is they've been wandering around in the wilderness. Why were they in the wilderness? Well, because they hadn't entered into the promised land as God had instructed. We're going to see more about that. But where were they going to and why? We didn't read the verse, but it's extremely plain if we take a look at verse 8 in chapter 1, where God says, Moses says to the people, say, I have set the land. Who's speaking here? Let me back up. No, this is the Lord speaking. Sorry. Moses speaking the words of the Lord. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them and to their offspring after them. So where are they headed? They've come from the wilderness, ultimately from Egypt, and we're going to talk about that still in a second. Where are they headed? They're heading into the promised land, right? And it's called the promised land because God had promised it to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And if you remember, Jacob's name was changed into Israel. One of his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, one of them was Joseph, who had gone down into Egypt and then had brought his entire family there. That's the second half of the book of Genesis. And then the people had become as numerous as stars in the sky, which had been God's promise to Abraham. So much so that Pharaoh was afraid of them. And what did Pharaoh do when they became that numerous down there in Egypt? What had been their job there? They became slaves, right? Pharaoh was so afraid. They were so numerous, becoming more numerous than the Egyptians themselves. And so Pharaoh enslaved them, and they had spent all of these generations now in slavery in Egypt, and now God has brought them out. Now, these two passages I just absolutely love. Sometimes the Old Testament has this wonderfully dry sense of humor. So, how long of a journey was this supposed to be, according to verse 2? 11 days. It's an 11 days journey from Horeb. Horeb is another name for Sinai. This is the mountain where God had given his law. It's 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea, which is where they are now. Now, how long had the trip taken them, according to verse 3? It says, in the 40th year. So Moses goes up there saying, we are now in the 40th year of our 11-day journey. Which makes the kids asking, are we there yet? Quite an impactful question, 39 years in. It was supposed to take less than 2 weeks. It's taken 40 years. Let's talk about why it took 40 years. Now, this next section, we're not going to reflect on it at all about leaders being appointed. It's going to talk about the way that there were too many people for Moses to lead, so there were leaders appointed of thousands and hundreds and fifties, etc., according to each tribe. Some of the civil structure that we're going to see addressed in chapter 5 gets sort of prefigured here a little bit. We're going to see there's a little bit of repetition. When you give an address to your people and it's 34 chapters long, every once in a while you need to remind them what you're talking about, because this would take an awfully long time to speak. So what I want to take a look at, though, is the section that our editors have labeled for us, and I think correctly, Israel's refusal to enter the land. I've labeled it here on the handout, conflict and consequences. So let's take a look, and we're going to go kind of section by section here. So I'm going to read up through verse 21 first. So Moses, again, recounting for the people what had happened 40 years prior to his speaking, says, then we set out from Horeb, you could also call it Sinai, and went through all that great and terrifying wilderness that you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, as the Lord our God commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea. Remember, that's only an 11-day journey, even for a big crowd. And I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has told you. Do not fear or be dismayed. So what's God's primary instruction here? You could say there really are two instructions, particularly in verse 21. What's he instructing his people? Go ahead, Bethany. Yep.
To go into the land and take possession of it.
Yep, go into the land, take possession of it. I've promised it to you for all of these years, all those generations since Abraham. And if you remember back to when Abraham first saw the promised land, God had said, the time is not yet, because the wickedness of its inhabitants has not yet reached its fullness. The time will come when I will give it to my people. So God, that's why it's called the promised land. God had promised it. So the first instruction, go into the land and take possession of it. And there's additionally with that, there's one other instruction. What is that? Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Don't fear.
Don't be afraid. That's one of the things we're going to hear over and over, both with Moses' final book of Deuteronomy, and then when we start to get into Joshua as well. That's going to be repeated over and over, and we'll see that with Moses' commission to Joshua in just a minute. So the instruction, go into the land, take possession of it. I've promised it to you for all this time. So go in, take possession of it, and do not be afraid. But let's take a look at what the people's response was. Verse 22. Then all of you came near me and said, let us send men before us, that they may explore the land for us, and bring us word again of the way by which we must go up in the cities into which we shall come. So Israel, in a sense, makes a counter-offer. God's instruction is just go in and take possession of the land. Israel makes a counter-offer. What's their counter-offer? Let's send in spies. Let's go see what the cities are like. Let's go see what the land is like. Now here's where we have to pause to remember, what has Israel just gone through? Moses is speaking 40 years later, but we're now in the time of when Israel is actually on that southern border of the promised land, and God is instructing them to go in. Where have they just left? We said it's an 11-day journey from Horeb or Sinai. So they've just left the mountain of the Lord, where they saw God give his law, and it was in the cloud. If you listened this morning, that was part of our reading, is that God had given his law. And then when Moses went into the tent of meeting, his face would shine afterwards. He'd have to put on a veil because he'd been in God's presence. That's what they've just been living through for this 11-day journey. In addition to all of the miraculous events that had happened on Mount Sinai, the storms and the displays of God's power, they'd made the calf, God had punished them, but then God had rescued them. But if we back up, how did they get to Mount Sinai? By what route had they come? They'd come through the Red Sea, which God had parted for them and then had closed back up on whom? On the Egyptians, on Pharaoh's army and all of his chariots. So God had destroyed the most powerful army in the world by means of the Red Sea, while rescuing the Israelites. And the Israelites hadn't fired a shot. The Israelites didn't have to fight at all. God had done all of their fighting for them, which shouldn't surprise us, because when they got to the Red Sea, what had just happened before that in Egypt?
Lots of plagues.
All the plagues, exactly right. All 10 plagues. It was like God was one by one assassinating all of the Egyptian gods as he would take them on and show, no, actually, I have authority over the Nile. I have authority over blood. I have authority over the insects or over the crops or over the flocks, culminating with the Passover event when God showed he had authority over death itself. And so they've seen the plagues which had toppled Egyptian civilization. They've seen the Red Sea where God rescued them but destroyed Pharaoh's army. They've seen the miracles on Mount Sinai. All of this, even if we're as expansive as we can be, all of this has happened within the last year. Some of it within the last couple of weeks. And here they arrive at God's land, and he says, go in. This is the land I've been promising to you. Go in and take possession of it. And they say, can we think about this first? Can we just send in some guys so that we know what we're getting into? And of course, that's not going to end well. But already, before we even hear how the report of the spies and everything went, what is this showing on Israel's part?
It seems like they're reneging on the covenant.
It does seem like they're reneging on...
Redo the terms.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting here is it's not even that they're redoing the terms. They're finally to the end of God's promise where they're supposed to get the gifts. And they're like, I'm not sure about this. Because, maybe this would go badly. It's like, you just defeated the greatest army in the world, the greatest civilization in the world, and you didn't even fire a shot. What are you afraid of here? If God says, go in, don't you think he's got the capability to do that? But there are some reasons for compassion. We had it as an open discussion this morning, but they've never led themselves, right? I mean, they were slaves all that time in Egypt. Slaves don't get to make choices for themselves. They were just told what to do, right? And then when they left, God's been leading them by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And so to have to find their own way, okay, maybe that's a little frightening. And if there's one thing that slaves never, ever are allowed to do, it's train for war, right? And so they have no military training whatsoever. They would have no skill with arms, that sort of thing, unless they'd somehow secretly and illegally done it, but that certainly wouldn't be the bulk of them. So while there are a lot of Israelites, probably are not a lot of Israelite warriors, because nobody's going to let the slaves, maybe there were some bodyguards or that sort of thing among them, but they're certainly not going to let the slaves run the risk of forming an army. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
But slaves wouldn't typically talk back to their masters. So this is like a question of the trust of that higher authority.
Exactly. Yep. So slaves don't talk back to their masters. But when the Israelites are essentially talking back to God, this ultimately shows, we've tried to show every possibility for being compassionate, for why they might be fearful, but ultimately this is a failure to trust God. God says, that's the land I've been promising you for generations. I've promised you this land. We're here. We've arrived. Go in and enjoy it. And they're like, I don't know. We got to think about this.
I keep thinking of today. What's
Yeah.
going on today?
Yes.
It's not applying.
Yep.
It's a gift.
Well, there's two aspects that what's going on today can affect or can be informed here. So for starters, and I mentioned this morning, so I'm glad you brought it up, Gene. Is there not still some pretty significant dispute over who ought to possess that particular spot of land? It's fascinating, but the nation of Israel, if you weren't aware, is about the same size as the state of New Hampshire. It's almost the same shape. It's almost exactly the same square footage or square mileage. It's not a big place, but it's been promised to a lot of people. The Amorites were already there, but it had been promised to the Israelites. Obviously, spoiler alert, they're going to go in and they're going to take possession of it, but they're not going to clear everybody out as God had instructed them to do, which means there are going to be a lot of different people claiming rights.
Same with the Gaza Strip today.
Yep.
It's very similar.
Yep, exactly. This is not a new thing. This didn't start on October 7th. It didn't start with the Zionist movement in the 40s and 50s of this century, or well, I guess last century technically, right? But this has a long history, right? We're roughly 1400 BC when these events are happening, and already these are contested lands. So there's a long history. The other way, though, beyond just what we see happening in terms of military actions in Israel, Palestine now, is the human tendency to fail to trust God. God says, I'm giving you this land, and they're like, we're not so sure about this, right? So let's see what results here. So what was the people's response? Well, the people's response was they wanted to send in the spies. Now, picking up with 23 to 33, because this sets up the conflict. I'm going to ask you to sort of summarize for me what we're seeing here. Verse 23, Moses admits, the thing seemed good to me, and I took 12 men from you, 1 man from each tribe, and they turned and went up into the hill country, and came to the valley of Eshcol and spied it out. And they took in their hands some of the fruit of the land, and brought it down to us, and brought us word again, and said, it is a good land that the Lord our God is giving us. Yet you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. And you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt, to give us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us. Where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven, and besides we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. Then I said to you, do not be in dread or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt, before your eyes. And in the wilderness, where you have seen how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place. Yet in spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God, who went before you in the way to seek you out a place to pitch your tents, in fire by night and in the cloud by day, to show you by what way you should go. All right, so this has set up the conflict. And what is the conflict? Can you kind of summarize it for me, Bethany? Yeah.
They didn't trust that God would go for them to keep them safe and give them the provision they needed to take the land.
Exactly. They're not trusting that God will go before them to keep them safe, to provide for them to take the land. And so what are they doing in response? They're refusing to go in. He's saying, go in, I'm going to give it to you. And they're saying, And what's literally the biggest reason that they don't want to go in?
The people are too tall.
The people are tall. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but it's just, when you see it in those terms, it's so stark and so amazing that God, who has just thundered away on Mount Sinai, who has parted the waters of the Red Sea and drowned Pharaoh and his army, who has just done all of the plagues to defeat all of the Egyptian civilization, they're afraid God can't help them because the people are tall? I mean, well, grant, all right, maybe it would be a little bit frightening, and we'll talk a little bit about the Anakim, but what we ultimately see here is a failure to trust God. And they had every possible evidence that God was more than capable of what he was doing. The Israelites were not an army. The Egyptians were an enormous army. The Amorites weren't particularly known as being powerful. Though we do have, and this is the one thing, you can go way down this rabbit hole because there are some really weird theories, I'd have to say speculations, not even theories, about the sons of the Anakim. They're also called the Nephilim. They show up a fair bit in these first 5 books of the Bible. Very little elsewhere, although one particular exception to that. But the one thing that is universally acknowledged about the Anakim or the Nephilim, they're big. They're really big. There's theories about why that is. Like I said, most of that tends to be speculation. But interesting, in this area, what we can call Israel, Palestine, some of the archaeologists avoid any of the political debate around it by calling it the Levant, which just means the area where the rivers flow. So we could call it that if you want. But that strip, that New Hampshire-sized portion of land, that's what we're talking about, right? Well, we know that they're reporting that the sons of the Anakim, or the Nephilim is the other name that they're used, are reported as being there. We know that the Israelites did not wipe out everybody. Does anybody remember a rather notable event that happened between one of the Israelites and one of the Philistines, and that Philistine was known for being really, really big? Goliath, right? Who is recorded for us, dude's like 9 feet tall, right? And so the belief is he may very well be descended from these Anakim. So I can be a little more sensitive to Israel's concerns. If you walk in and the guys are all 9-10 feet tall, that maybe we have no military training, and you start to get afraid. And I think this is part of our human nature. When we look at the specifics, we can get lost. When we look at who God is and what he has promised, we can remember that God's no more afraid of a 9-foot tall guy than a 6-foot tall guy, right? Not like God's going to say, oh my goodness, he's 50% taller. What shall I do? Right? Cheryl.
That's why I love the cross here is so big.
It's enormous.
It really keeps your perspective.
I like that. Yeah, that the cross here is so big. It keeps our perspective of how much bigger than us God is. Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful point. One of the things I should mention, though, because like I said, you can go down quite a rabbit hole about the Nephilim or the Anakim. If you remember, there was a film about Noah a while ago that really was not particularly biblical, but they were rock monsters in that film. So there's one way you could go. One of the interesting things, you may have heard of a historian named Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, lived within about 100 years of Christ's life. And he did record that there had been giants in the land. And what's interesting about that is he records whose bones are still on display to this day. So even within 100 years of Christ's life, there still were some physical evidences of gigantic humans having existed in this place. So is that enough for us to believe that God can't do what he's promised to do? No. We can be at least a little bit compassionate to Israel's fearfulness, but God has already promised them this land. And this has set up the conflict. God says go in. Israel says, not doing that. They're really big. And then what we see is the consequence that gets set up. So verse 34 and following. The Lord heard your words and was angered, and he swore, not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give your fathers, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him and to his children I will give the land on which he has trodden, because he has wholly followed the Lord. If you go back and read in Numbers when this happened, Caleb was the one who tore his robes and everything and said, no, God can do what he has promised to do. The other one was Joshua. So it says, even with me the Lord was angry on your account, and said, you shall not go in there. Remember this. We're coming back to this in the last section we're talking about today. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. And as for your little ones, who you said would become a prey, and your children, who today have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there. And to them I will give it, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn and journey into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. This is the definition of backtracking. You don't trust me, and at the words of Red Sea, I wonder how the people responded, like, oh, right, that Red Sea thing, right? But we see now the consequences. God says nobody from this generation of adults at the time is going to go in. And then I love God's irony here, that he says, and the children that you say are too helpless that they're going to end up slaughtered, those are going to be the ones who end up slaughtering the inhabitants. Those who you think I can't protect, I'm actually going to use as the warriors. So it's a wonderful turnabout there, and there's definitely some irony going on. So that was the setup, and then the result was the wandering that they've now endured for 40 years. Cheryl, what you got?
When he says the children who today have no knowledge of good or evil, he's talking about they don't remember the time of slavery in Egypt and the time of rescue.
Yep, exactly right. Your little ones whom you said they have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there. Yep, so the little ones who didn't see God's plagues, or if they did, they were so young that its import was really lost on them. The Red Sea, I think he's probably particularly referring, because the rest of the book is going to be the giving of the law again to them, because that's who's alive now. Everybody else has passed away. Everybody who could really clearly remember in an adult way, because we know even the things that we can remember from when we were 12 or 14, it's not quite the same, is it, as the things that you started to be aware of when you were an adult. We as a society use 18. Their society actually used quite a bit younger than that, because life expectancy was not as long. 40 years really would wipe out a whole generation. Now it's not hard for us to imagine, well, if a guy was 35, then he'd just be 75. But not a whole lot of people made it to 75 when you're wandering around the wilderness. So God waited for that whole generation who did not trust him to have passed away in the wilderness until he's going to end. So yes, that's what he means by those who didn't know good and evil. And that's part of why God, through Moses, is now going to reiterate what is good and what is evil. What is my covenant and its stipulations. It's also why Moses is probably so motivated to give this historical survey that he's giving, because who knows what they've picked up through the stories of their families and so forth as they're wandering around. And of course, if you're familiar with the wanderings, it was from crisis to crisis to crisis, right? So he's trying to give a God's eye perspective. That's why Deuteronomy can be so helpful to study, because it's God's summary of Israel's history up to this point. And yeah, sure.
It's kind of a background question, but is there any idea, is he actually talking to all the whole nation? Is he giving this to the scribe or the leaders of it? Like, how is this being released?
How was it delivered? That we don't entirely know. I mean, clearly it was written down because we have it. So was it written down and then recorded so that it could be passed on through each of the tribes, for instance? It's certainly hard to imagine, given the size of the congregation that we're talking about, probably over 1 million people at this point. We don't know how much attrition there's been over those 40 years. It's hard to imagine that there was any one setting where Moses, close to the end of his life, could have stood and delivered a 34-chapter oration that would have been heard by everybody present. So this is probably more likely, this is total guess on my part, so don't take this to the bank at all. If we get to heaven and learn it's different, it won't surprise me at all. But it would make sense that maybe Moses has gathered those same leaders that we skipped the section, but he talked about appointing the leaders. Maybe he's brought together the leaders of the thousands, or we make this a smaller group and we give the address, and then it's their job to pass that on.
Like they did when they came back from Babylon?
Exactly, yep. So we have a biblical example when they came back from the Babylonian exile and the law was then read. They had the priests that were going out within the congregation to explain that which is being taught and to spread that word. So Jesus fed the 5,000. They were gathered to hear him. It's not impossible to imagine. There were women and children too. But we can imagine a crowd of, say, 15,000. If you're in a sort of natural amphitheater, if the geography is correct and the sound could carry, maybe one person, even on amplified, could address 15,000. I don't know how one person on amplified could address 600,000 or 1 million. So the recording and delivery isn't recorded for us, but we have to assume that's probably part of how this was delivered.
I think I probably have more compassion for maybe that's why the Israelites were afraid than, because like they have the spies report has to come in that this is a great land.
Yep.
And then it has to filter
its way out.
All the way through.
And they bring the fruits of the land and they say it's flowing with milk and honey, but which do you think people are going to grasp onto more? That there's apples and there's milk and there's honey, or that there's giants that might squash you? Which of those two pieces of information do you think would travel a little faster?
I like
right?
the cities are fortified to heaven part.
Yes, yeah, and the fortified cities up to heaven. One of the comments this morning that I genuinely don't think I had ever encountered, but was really interesting, was the parallelism with Eden. That you have this promised land, the people take some of the fruit, but they're banished from the land, and even the promise that it's your children through whom the promise shall be given. A lot of parallels to what happened with Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And so I thought that's a fascinating idea. And part of what I love about studying Scripture, God is an incredible author, and he brings these wonderful things to light. So, all right, so we're very, very clear on the setup now. Moses is at the end of his life. This is what has led to this particular point. We're going to skip a number of things here. Interestingly enough, then Israel decides, oh, wait, we changed our mind. They try to go in and fight. They lose because God says, no, that's not the way it works. I'm no longer with you at this point. Then we have this section labeled the wilderness years. It's properly labeled. We have the defeat of King Sihon and King Og, two names that I absolutely love. I especially think Og is a name that deserves a comeback. But the irony that's pointed out here is, why were they afraid to go into the land? Because they were afraid they'd have to fight. So what do they end up having to do? They end up having to fight, but they end up having to fight in the wilderness. They end up having to fight in the place where they're not going to keep the land, even if they win. So look at the downgrade of what takes place. Oh, the other thing that we got into a little this morning that I want to mention is the people's murmuring against God. Going back just a little bit, it says that they were in their tents and they murmured against the Lord. Let me find it. And if you find it before I do, let me know. After the spies come back. 27. Yes, there you go. Perfect. Thank you, Cheryl. And you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to give us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. That makes no sense. If God hated you, why would he have sent the plagues? Why would he have parted the Red Sea? Why would he have given his law at Mount Sinai? But once we're afraid, once we fail to trust God, we'll invent almost any outlandish tale. If God's desire was to destroy the Israelites, it would have been a lot more efficient to have the Egyptians do it. The Egyptians were actually really good at it. There's no need to rescue them, to part the Red Sea, to reveal his law on Mount Sinai. If he hated them and wanted to destroy them, there were a lot better ways to do it. But once we're afraid, oftentimes we'll believe stories that make no sense otherwise. Jonathan?
That's something that kind of permeates even now in modern culture, is that, if among secular people that, God actually just secretly hates us because this bad thing is happening. And so nothing really changes. Yeah,
and nothing really changes because in modern times we still invent this idea God dislikes us. That's why these bad things are happening. So if he didn't like us, he didn't have to make us. There are a lot better ways that he could have gone about. But again, when there's fear and when there's rebellion against God, we'll believe some pretty outlandish stories rather than simply taking God at his word. Yeah, sure.
How do you feel about the fact that Moses agreed to send those spies in? Like, it kind of undermines the covenant in the people's eyes because he agrees to that.
Yep. So thank you, because that was another thing we talked about a little bit this morning. When they said they wanted to send in spies, Moses is honest here in his retelling, and he says, well, that seemed good to me. That plan seemed good to me. It should not have seemed good to him. Part of what I love about Scripture is our quote-unquote heroes are very often far from heroic. And there's two things with that I absolutely love. One, if you were making up a religion, you wouldn't have made this up, right? It kind of, even just like I didn't mention it this morning, but all those place names at the beginning, those are real places. If you're making up a story, you don't give that much detail because then people can find out if it's true, right? If you're making up a story, you say, I went into a cave and God gave me a vision, because nobody can prove or disprove that one. You don't give all these place names and dates and that sort of thing, right? But the other thing that I like about it is not just we can trust in this, partly because who would have ever made this up? But I love how unheroic our heroes are, because so often I'm not heroic either. And God still uses these unheroes to do his work, where he is the true hero. And we're going to come back to that in just a minute with Moses and the end of what we're looking at here. So I think we have a pretty good understanding here of where we're at. The other thing with that I think it was Elijah who shared this morning, is that it's easy when we first read these things to sit in judgment on the characters and think, what doofuses they are. But then we realize these are the same mistakes that we make ourselves. So we can really relate then. How many times have we had God's promise but failed to trust it? How many times have we believed something far more outlandish than what God has revealed in our rebellion against him? So we can relate. We're skipping a bunch. We have all these defeats and everything. We're coming toward the end of Deuteronomy chapter 3. So we're on page 148 now in the Pew Bibles. Starting with verse 21 and 22. First, I want to see this commission because it's going to be so important after Deuteronomy. This is Moses speaking. And I commanded Joshua at that time, this is verse 21, your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings, that's talking about Sihon and Og. So will the Lord do to all the kingdoms into which you are crossing. You shall not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you. So what was Moses' instruction to Joshua? This is already now a repeat of God's instruction previously. Don't be afraid. And the way that a lot of us know this, and I still use it a lot as a confirmation verse, is from Joshua chapter 1. Be strong and courageous, do not fear and do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you. That's the instruction. Don't be afraid. But it's not just don't be afraid. Thankfully, he gives him a basis. Have you ever worked with you have a child who's panicked about something? Just saying don't be afraid doesn't really go that far. Even with our own emotions, often, if we're afraid or we're anxious or we're frustrated or whatever, just saying don't be that, not necessarily helpful. But what's wonderful is God also gives the basis. On what basis shall Joshua not be afraid? What reason does he have to not be afraid? It's in verse 22. Yep. God's the one who will do the fighting for you. God's not afraid of 9 feet tall people. God's not afraid of any people. God's not afraid of cities fortified to the heavens. He lives in the heavens. Even maybe calls to mind the Tower of Babel. Remember, right, when they say they're going to build the tower into heaven? And then it says, and God came down to see what they were doing. Love the irony that shows up there. All right, so that's the commission to Joshua. Excuse me. And then there are some limits that God sets, and this is what we're going to finish with, and we're just a little bit after 6, so I'll try to finish this in about 5 minutes or so. So 23 through 29. And I pleaded with the Lord at that time. Sorry, I need to grab a tissue real quick. That's much better than sniffling. I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, Enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward. Look at it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan. But charge Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he shall go over at the head of this people, and he shall put them in possession of the land that you shall see. So we remained in the valley opposite Beth Peor. All right, so what was Moses' request from God in this passage? God, can I please go into the promised land? And what's God's response? Stop asking me that. Don't bring this up anymore. I'm done talking with you about this. Because Moses should already be very clear that that's not going to happen and why that's not going to happen. But in order to do that, so I asked the question this morning. I won't ask for a show of hands because I suspect I know how many hands would have to go up. How many of you have ever, in the retelling of events, maybe put things in a particularly favorable light for the way that you had behaved and what you had done? Perhaps more so than could be called 100% accurate. I bring this up because Moses has now twice. It happened in chapter 1, I think it was verse 37. It happens again in chapter 3, verse 26. Here we're looking at it in 26. But the Lord was angry. Why? The Lord was angry with me because of you and wouldn't listen to me. You Israelites, you're the reason God's mad at me. You're the reason I can't go into the promised land. That's not my recollection of events. So let's take a quick detour to Numbers chapter 20, verses 2 to 13. That's the chapter or the book immediately previous. Page 128. Just listen if you want, or you can turn along and read along. Now there was no water for the congregation. This is while they're wandering around in the wilderness. And they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord." This is kind of a refrain for them. Whenever things are bad, they think God's trying to kill them or they wish they were dead. "Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come out of Egypt?" I love that. Made us come out of Egypt. They were pleading to come out of slavery. "Why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord, this is very much like what we read about this morning with God's glory appearing to Moses. The glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." And Moses took the staff from before the Lord, as he commanded him. A couple things I want to comment on, and then we're going to read a couple more verses. This is not the first time this has happened. This also happened with the congregation at Massah, very shortly after Mount Sinai, when there was no water, and God's instruction to Moses was quite similar but not the same. What was the difference? What was he supposed to do then? You're nodding, Cheryl, so I think you remember.
He struck that rock. He was supposed to talk to this one.
All right, so at Massah, the original time, not this time, the first time, God's instruction was take the staff, strike the rock, and water came out, right? Now the instruction, you pointed out, is different. Now he's supposed to speak to the rock. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out with that. If you were watching a videotape, it would not be hard to tell which one was happening, right? You could even turn the sound off, and you'd be able to tell the difference between someone hitting a rock with a staff and someone speaking to a rock, right? I want you to keep that in mind because of what we were talking about before. This is a vast number of people. Which one of those two actions is easier to see? The swinging of the staff and the striking of the rock, right? Let's be honest, it's more dramatic, right? And if it's a huge crowd of people, hundreds of thousands, even more than 1 million, how many of them could hear what was going on? It's easy to imagine that if Moses goes out and speaks to the rock, somebody will say, "Oh, look, there is water." They might not even think it was anything all that miraculous, right? As opposed to the big dramatic moment of Moses gets to, wind up and strike the rock and out comes the water. So you could understand if Moses might be a little tempted to do what he did before. And you could also understand if Moses was thinking, well, I struck it before and that worked. So I know that technique works. So look at what Moses does, and maybe we can start to understand. We're never told 100%, but I think we can make some guesses. And then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord, I would have translated this, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah," which means quarreling, "where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy." So was Moses relying more on what God had instructed previously, which he knew worked, rather than this new technique, which maybe he had more doubts about? Or was Moses going for the more dramatic and more visible striking of the rock instead of the speaking to the rock? Not sure. Jonathan, what do you got?
He also leaves God out of it entirely, saying that I'm doing it.
Exactly. So whichever the motivation was, what he does is he claims the authority and, in a sense, the glory for himself. So I'm more inclined, and I don't know, and maybe if we meet Moses in heaven, like Jesus met him on the Mount of Transfiguration, maybe if we meet him, we could ask him, although it might be kind of a sore topic, so don't bring it up the first time you meet him, at least, would be my advice. But maybe he could explain exactly why, but we can look at his words. And in his words, a good job spotting it, Jonathan, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" I'm sorry, what, Moses? Say that again. Do you have the ability to bring water out of a rock? Is that in your skill set? No, that's something that God gives or doesn't give. And notice, by the way, he still even gave it, God in his mercy, though the water was bitter. But the bigger issue here, And this is why God tells Moses, you're not going into my land. Because Moses was no longer holy. Moses was no longer representing God to the people. Moses was representing himself. That's completely non-negotiable. God had forgiven Moses. Came up this morning. Moses killed a man before God called him. That was before God called him. And God forgave that. And God can forgive anything. But particularly in this Old Testament setting, when you're called to the position Moses is called in, you are the stand-in for God. You don't get to ad-lib. You don't get to make it up. And you certainly don't get to take any of the glory for yourself. And that's also proven by the final verse here of verse 13. The Lord, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. So we see what happened there. It still is easy to think God's being harsh. In 40 years of Moses needing to lead them around and all the quarreling and all of the everything, this one time, and Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land, that seems a little harsh. We'll talk about that just a bit, but you can understand why.
To just speak to something and wow, that happened.
Yeah, I think you can make that argument.
He valued his own words enough to say this.
Yep.
But he didn't value God's word enough to say what God had said. And so I see in this a little bit of a parallel of this is Moses, like God forgave Moses for sending the spies, but this is almost Moses' version of the spies report.
Exactly. This is Moses' version of the spies. This is, in some way, we can't get all the way into Moses' own head. We can't psychologize him entirely, but this is Moses trusting his plans instead of God and enacting that in front of all the people and pretending that that was God's instruction, and putting himself in the place of God. That's Adam and Eve's sin too, right? And it's the people's sin. So this is very much Moses' parallel, even though it seems less egregious, perhaps. But I agree with you. You hit a rock with a stick and water comes out. It's easy to think, wow, maybe the rock just happened to be weak in that spot because it had a hidden well or something like that. Nothing so miraculous other than that God knew it. But if you just say, hey, rock, I'd like some water, and water starts coming out, yeah, that does, in a way, that's more powerful.
Yeah, because, let there be light.
Exactly. Yep, God speaks and it happens, and God had given Moses his word, and Moses trusted something else instead. That's the problem. And now, part of the proof is how does Moses still present it? All these years later, 2 different times, Deuteronomy chapter 1 and Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 26, but the Lord was angry with me because of you. He's still blaming someone else, proving that God was in fact justified in this punishment. But, and I'm going to bring us to a close here, what did God do instead? What did God allow Moses to do? He says, go up to the top of Mount Pisgah, look all around you at all the land that God is giving to your people. He still lets Moses see. And then, this is a kind of a preview, we're not going to get to it till session 7. Moses is not going to enter into the promised land. Where's he going instead? He's going to heaven. He's going to a much greater promised land. As proof, who shows up with Jesus? Perfect. It's today's transfiguration. Who shows up with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? Moses. He's not making a detour from hell when he does that. He is already getting to share in some way in the heavenly glory. God still brings him to the ultimate promised land. He just never sets foot on the physical promised land. But still God in his mercy grants him that glimpse, that chance to see, the promise that is about to come to light. And so I think that this is an incredible little side note of Moses and the complexity of what was going on with Moses, but also maybe helps to put to rest, because I'd always thought, man, God was being just super harsh here, way too harsh for one little error. Well, A, it's not one little error, and B, Moses is still clinging to the false presentation of it all these years later, still blaming somebody else. And yet God still gives him the grace of allowing him to see the promised land and still welcomes him to his side in a heavenly fashion. So it shows God's grace once again. Yeah, sure.
The whole narrative makes me so excited because I think about a couple weeks ago, one of the readings was about Joshua.
Yep.
Being a symbol for Jesus.
Yep.
And Moses believes in Joshua being able to take the people across, and now he goes to heaven. Like, it's just such a beautiful picture of how God redeems.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so wonderful that there are not our heroes aren't really heroes. God redeems them. God still uses them. And like you said, it was just 2 weeks ago because it was Jesus' baptism where we had the reading about Joshua bringing the people over the Jordan River. Well, that's what happens right after Deuteronomy. In the very next book, Joshua's going to, and Joshua's name is Jesus. Jesus is the Greek version, Joshua is the Hebrew, so a new Joshua will come. Interestingly, Deuteronomy talks about a new Moses will come, who will teach us God's truer law, which of course we know is fulfilled in Christ. So all of this points us to, God's only telling one story throughout all of Scripture, and that's the story of the salvation that comes to completion in Christ. All of these other details and places and names and crowds of people and events, they're all just to point us to Him. And this is part of what I ended with this morning, and it's part of why I'm super excited about doing Deuteronomy, even though at first I wasn't so sure. It was the only Old Testament nominee that came up. So I'm like, okay, let's give that a try. But as I've started prepping for it, I'm realizing how much gospel there is, particularly in the next few chapters that we're going to look at, and how much God really is telling one story throughout all of history, His story. The story of Christ, His coming and His redeeming for us. We see that redemption for the Israelites, who God had every right to wipe out but didn't. For Moses, who God had every right to wipe out but didn't. But God instead, through Moses, who's flawed, to the Israelites, who are flawed, He gives this renewing of His covenant, His instructions for how to be His people in His promised land. And that's what we'll get to start to dive into. So for next week, we're going to read and look at, we probably won't do it verse per verse because it's 49 verses, but there's a fair bit we're going to be able to go over. We're only looking at chapter 4 because what I've labeled this as historical background or historical context. I don't think that we would think of all of that as the historical prologue of the covenant itself. Even if you just glance forward, Moses says, "And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you and do them that you may live," etc. So it now takes on much more of that formal language. And he's going to spend much of chapter 4 giving a little summary of the historical prologue. So it may be splitting hairs there, but we're going to look a little bit more of the history. Then we'll get into the stipulations and the real meat of Deuteronomy, that second giving of the law. And so why don't we go ahead and close with prayer. And thanks everybody for being willing to be flexible and do this with our time together tonight for the benefit, because I know we have a number of people who watch the Bible study online who aren't able to be with us in person. It failed last week, which was the close of James. It would be a real bummer to have it fail entirely and not replace it at the beginning of a study, 7-week study in Deuteronomy. So let's say a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you have given your word to flawed humans, for flawed humans, through flawed humans, and yet you continue by that word to do your work, your saving work, first of your people of Israel, and then through Christ, who has fulfilled that role of your chosen people, so that we too might be numbered among your chosen people, among those for whom you have died and given your gifts. We know our flaws and failures. Moses had flaws and failures. The Israelites had flaws and failures. But you continue to show your grace upon grace. So on this Transfiguration Day, we remember the glimpse of your divine glory that Jesus gave to his apostles. We thank you for those glimpses that we see through your word as well. As we go forth from this place, pray that you would go forth with your word active in us. Guide us safely home and use that word to transform not just us, but through us, all those around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, thanks all of you. Thanks all of you online. I'll turn this off real quick.